One of the issues that all of us run into is how to make our screen displays at our services easy to follow along with. And so in this episode of Practical Church Planting, we're going to give you 8 ways to improve your screen displays.
Well, thanks for joining us again today on Practical Church Planting for our second week live on video. Well, not live, but on video.
Yeah. So if you listen to the podcast, Practical Church Planting on YouTube, you can find us there as well.
That's right. Today we're going to be giving you 8 ways to improve your screen display.
Yeah, this is called Practical Church Planting.
It's about as practical as this gets.
We try to think of like small things that people might not always think about.
Yep.
For screen display, what we mean is how you present your lyrics and your sermon notes, whether it's a projector or a TV screen. Mm-hmm. Whatever you use for your projection needs,
yes,
or your screen needs, how can you make that better for your service and less distracting and all that?
Yep.
So here's some things that we do that you can try as well. 8 ways to improve your screen display in your services. Here's the first one. Go faster with your lyrics. This is one of the biggest issues plaguing churches all over the globe.
Yes, it is. Yep.
Including ours.
Yep. Yep.
And finding people that can do it.
Yep.
The importance of being fast or ahead on your worship lyrics is really important if you want people to sing along, because what typically happens is we wait till they sing the last word and then we click to the next screen. By then, the first or second word of the next screen has already been sung, and the people in the audience, if they don't, especially if they don't know the song, don't know what it is.
Yep.
And they don't know when to sing. Or I've also found it when you go slow on lyrics and then you have slides that are like repeated so they don't change. People are hesitant to keep repeating what's on the screen because they think that it's going to change and they're not going to know what it is. So they don't repeat the lyrics.
Yeah.
And so what you want to do is you want to be ahead, and you always want to err on the side of too fast. Especially, I mean, people have it different ways, but like here at New City, we have like 2 rows of lyrics or whatever. So it's like 4 or 5 words per whatever. And we read ahead. And so we know what's coming up. We don't need the screen to be on the whole time. And so what you need to do is depending on how fast the song is, with a word or 2 still left on the current slide, you need to go to the next slide so that people can be prepared for what's coming. A part of the problem with this is the person, if you have ProPresenter or whatever you might use, that person running slides can see all of the slides. So they know what's coming next, so it's easy for them not to realize the people in the auditorium don't. One trick you could tell your slides people is assume you don't know what the next, like if you didn't know what the next slide was, you would go sooner.
Yeah. And
so one of the biggest ways to disengage people from singing is to go really slow on your slides. You always want to err on too fast. People read ahead, and when you go slow, it makes it really hard for people to sing because they don't know what's coming up.
Yeah, I think the easiest thing here is to give your slides, whether it's a person or a whole team, like a hard and fast rule of this is where it needs to be changed. And I know some songs, once you're good at what you're doing, some songs can be a little bit different because they have different tempos and stuff, but it's just easier than leaving it up to the individual person. And what I think is easiest is just tell them that you change it as soon as we start saying the last word. And so that way it's done by the time we're done with it, or you can even say the second to last word. Whatever it is, just give people a hard and fast rule of just do this, and then once they get good, people will naturally start to do it a little bit better based on the song they're on their own. But if you just leave it up to the individual person and just say things like, can you make sure to speed it up? It's hard to really wrap your head around what that means. So giving people a hard and fast rule. And I think this was especially true. It's easy for us to miss this is if you're like church staff, pastor, because you know all the songs. And unless you're looking for it, most of the time, even if you're looking at the screen, you're not really reading the lyrics if you know the song.
Yep.
But yesterday, we record on Monday. So yesterday, here at New City, I was running our live stream, so I wasn't out singing along. And so I was watching lyrics more so than usual, but we played a song that I'd never even heard before. And I wasn't paying attention to how fast they were going. He probably did fine, but like if he was going slow, I would have had no clue what was coming next. I never even heard the song in my life, and so like that's rare that happens because we generally play the same group of songs, but when we add something new, if I never heard it, it's like it puts you in the shoes of all the other people that aren't as regular of churchgoers, and so as fast as consistent as possible, if you can just create a hard and fast rule, then that way it doesn't matter if you have a quote unquote good screens person or a bad screens person. They just have to do this one thing and stick to it.
And this is important too. If you listen to this when the time it comes out, it's December Christmas music that you don't sing throughout the year. People don't know the words. And this is something that you have to tell people all the time. You can't tell them once. All the time. We are telling our screens person.
Yeah.
And sometimes you feel
Weekly.
bad, but like this is really important if you want to create a distraction-free service and you want people to engage, particularly if they're new or if they invited a friend and they don't know any of the songs and maybe they try to sing along, but the words are always behind. It's just one of the biggest things that I think at church we get used to, we don't pay attention to, that new people or people that are nervous, it's really hard to engage when the slides are slow.
And another thing, just to like something to keep in your mind to warn your people of. Most songs have like have a break in the lyrics somewhere, and so what we do, and probably most people do, is there's nothing on the screen during that time, or there's a background, but there's no lyrics on, and then it comes back on when it's time to sing again. But if you're kind of a more inexperienced, I guess, screens person, a lot of times they'll put it up right as that person's about to start singing, and so if you don't know the song, you're sitting there looking at no lyrics, and you see the person like lift up a mic and about to start singing, and you almost get this like anxiety of like, oh, what am I supposed to say?
Yep.
And so always being ahead and always like erring on the side of just, if I feel like if it's to the point where the screens person is uncomfortable at how early they are, it's actually probably bordering on okay.
Yeah. So again, give them a hard and fast rule.
Yeah.
The beginning of the second to last word or the last word, no matter what, always change it. And then tell them, repeat it often, because they'll remember that Sunday, and the next Sunday they serve again, they won't repeat it. We have to do this all the time. So you want to go faster with your lyrics than you think you do. This is kind of a technical, I guess this whole episode's kind of technical, but it makes a really big difference. And it's something that we don't really think about or we don't feel like addressing, but yeah, you want to address it.
And I mean, if we're being honest, this goes for all these, but like if especially if you have an issue with this, you notice this a lot more than your person running the screens do. And you think about this a lot more. So you might be thinking about this during the week of like, oh man, that was really rough. But the person running the screens probably isn't going to think about it till next week. Or if you have a team of them, then next month, the time they're next doing it again. So repeating it over and over may seem redundant to you, but to them, it's really not. It doesn't come across as often as we think it does.
Yep. So go faster with your worship lyrics. That is a big and easy thing to do if you stay on top of it. Way to improve your screen display. Here's a second one that kind of goes with it, and this is that you want to limit the overlapping or the fading of words. And so I think the default in certain programs or whatever, when you go from one slide to the next, like the text will kind of fade out, and the other one will fade in. Well, this is also a problem if you're trying to read words because they're overlapping, and oftentimes it's slow. And so if you have somebody who does the lyrics slow, and then the text like fades out and fades back in, you could be 3 to 4 words into the next slide before you know what you're singing. And I actually saw this yesterday on Instagram. I was looking at, churches was posting their, Instagram stories, whatever. And one of them I was following was they had a fade and they were kind of slow.
Yeah.
And so they would change the slide when they were singing the first word of the next slide, which you're already a little behind.
Yeah.
And then it was fading. So it was literally like 3 to 4 words in before it was on the screen. And people just don't think about it. And so we have a little bit of a fade because that way it's not harsh, but it's quick.
It's very little.
And so you want to limit the overlapping and the fading of your words. You can change it. We use ProPresenter. You can change the settings and whatever you use. But that also keeps people focused and not distracted when it takes the lyrics forever to change.
Yeah. If you're not like a super technical person, or maybe you've done some of these things and you're like, I don't really know what to look for in some of these, just find, obviously you can contact us, but find a church that you like and follow and just contact them, especially if you're not a big, like if you have ProPresenter, if you don't know all the ins and outs. If you contact a production person and just say, hey, we're using ProPresenter 6, 7, how much of a fade should we put on it? Because you can go down to like the millisecond.
Do you know our fade?
I don't. I was thinking that as you were talking, I was like, man, I should have looked it up. But I mean, if you email us or whatever, ask us, I can look it up and get it for you. But anyone you ask will give you a quick answer of this is what we do. And most people are pretty similar if they know, if it's like set up right and they know what they're doing.
And I would assume as well, if you go and look at some of the larger churches, like Life Church or Elevation, some of these churches that are really big online, and you were to watch their worship, you probably will find little to no fade. Yeah. And you probably will find that they are quick with their lyrics and not slow.
Yeah. Yeah. So if some ask around, ask people what you should do in some of these. If you want to improve it but not entirely sure how to go about it or whatever, shoot us an email, ask somebody. People will give you an answer.
So those are the first two. Go faster with your lyrics and limit the overlapping and the fading of words so that people can actually read what's on the screen. Here's a third way to improve your screens, and this will go to the sermon.
Yes.
We'll pivot a little bit. Yep. And that is to have only one sermon point per slide.
This is a little bit more of a hot take than the others.
One sermon point per slide for many reasons. The biggest one is that whenever you see a new slide on a screen, no matter who you are, you will read everything on the screen before you put your attention back on the person that's speaking, whether it's a sermon or a presentation or whatever. And so we've all had presentations where we saw where there's like all these bullet points. And even if they go with the bullet points one by one, like they'll do the first bullet point and they'll explain, and the second one, you're not really paying attention until you've read or skimmed all of the screen.
Yeah.
So it's distracting. And it's just you don't need to get to the next part until you do it. I always remember it was a book that I was reading, I don't even know, about a year or two ago on communication or something like that. And they had this, I'm going to butcher this so bad, but it stuck with me. They had this lady who helps do they're a company that helps create presentations for people that have keynotes or whatever. And this is what they do. They do one slide per point so that people can focus on what's being said and not be distracted. And so they did this study where they had, this one presentation had like 100 and something slides. And then they asked people at the end of it, how many slides do you think were shown? And they guessed like 40 to 50, like a third of how many slides there were. So you might feel like it's a lot of slides, but the person in the audience doesn't think that. They're just being engaged and it's interesting. And so the point is, like, we try to put a lot of information on there because we want to talk through it, but people aren't listening to you till they read through the slide. And it's not really helpful to have information on your screens that you're not addressing yet, because then it's like, what am I supposed to do with that? So one sermon point per slide, and that will help people stay engaged.
Yeah, I think the whole point of a sermon point, if that's the way that you write and give sermons, is that you want to give someone something memorable that they can like anchor that portion of the message to. And so if you're putting a lot of stuff on the screens, it makes it a lot harder to have the one thing to actually be able to remember and take home from it or take out of it. Where if you just give people I guess we're not really talking about how long a point should be, but err on the side of shorter. A little side note. But if you give someone something shorter and that's the main thing that's on the screen, it's going to be much easier for them to internalize and remember what that thing is versus having a lot of stuff on the screen. And I think a lot of times, especially if you're like a bullet point kind of person, it doesn't seem that bad because obviously you start with a small amount and then you're adding a small amount each time. And so in your mind, probably, you're thinking like that it's kind of the same idea. You're adding a small amount. It should be easy to remember. But by the end, you have this whole ton of information on a screen. And it's just, even though you've potentially walked through people through it in a good way and communicated well, it's just hard when you're looking at that at the end to wrap your mind around everything that's going on and to not continually looking back on it, reading back instead of paying attention to what you're saying.
Yeah, and part of this too that is helpful is, like you're saying, it keeps people engaged on what you're talking about. Like, the people kind of come in and out, they're not always paying attention.
Yeah.
So when you have one point on the slide, on the screen at a time, and they come back to after not paying attention or whatever, they know what you're saying. Now, this is kind of a 3.5, so this is not really a point, but it goes with it, is that you also want to make sure what is being talked about is on the screen, and when it's not, you take it off. So either you leave it up and you talk, and we'll talk through this in a second, how to make sure your screens person's on the same page as the person who's preaching. But you leave it up the whole time they're talking about it, and then if you need to have, like, go back to the sermon graphic or whatever in the meantime, like once they move to the next thing, if there's not a scripture reference or another point, you need to take it off the screen. Otherwise, it's distracting because people will be like, what are they saying, and what does this have to do with this point? So 1 point per thing, and leave it up as long as they're talking about it, and then add multiple slides if you need to, but it helps people stay focused on what's being said. Don't put a lot of text on the screen.
Yeah, I think we all want to, we've talked about this before, but we all hope and think and want to be better communicators than we are in reality. And so things like this that help people, I think we can, maybe easily think that if I just communicate well enough, and doesn't really matter as much if I leave something on the screen because people will focus more on what I'm saying, but it's just not true. And people will focus on what's on the screen and will look to it more often if there's something there. And so if you're talking about something that's unrelated to what's on the screen, it creates a little bit more of a distraction, and it might not be a giant distraction, but I think we want to eliminate as many distractions as possible.
And Brian was saying, this past Sunday we had I wasn't preaching, we had someone else preach, and the person was doing the slide. They weren't used to it. Yeah. And so the person doing the slides wasn't used to doing it with them or whatever, and they left a meme up because he started with a meme. And he left it up, you were saying, for a couple of minutes, and it was like you almost came out of the live stream room and told him to take it down because it was distracting.
Yeah, like it made sense in the moment. For when he was talking about it, it was like a funny end to a story he told. But then as he's moving on and getting into like prefacing how it relates to the message and getting into it, then it becomes kind of awkward. And it even if you're paying attention as the screens person, maybe not you, but the screens person is paying attention to what's going on, it comes across as if they're not paying attention and forgot to move along with the message.
So there you go. Only one sermon point per slide. Add multiple if you need to. but having a lot of information is distracting. The fourth one that kind of goes with it is that you want to limit how much text is on the screen at one time. So this is like, what are you talking about if I'm only doing one point? Well, if you're reading a quote or if you're reading scripture and you have the scripture on the screen, sometimes you'll see just like a ton of text.
Just block of text.
And it's like nobody wants to read all that, and it just is distracting and it's hard to follow. So have multiple screens. Depends on how big your screens are and fonts and all that sort of thing. But if you have like a passage and you're reading like 10 verses straight, I don't know, you probably want to limit it to 2 to 3 verses per screen. And that's kind of it. And just, again, have multiple screens so it's easy to read. It's easier to follow along with. Again, if you have like a big passage on one screen, even if you have a big projector and you could like fit 8 verses, well, people get distracted. They lose focus. They don't know where the person is. And so if you want them to be able to pick up where they're reading, then you want to add multiple screens to it so you don't have a ton of text on one screen.
Yeah, I'm sure most people are the same way, but for me, obviously, if something's on screen, I want to read along with it.
Yeah.
And if I miss, like if I look up a couple seconds later or whatever, and they've started, then I want to find where they're reading. And so it's just hard for me to pay attention and focus on what they're saying if I'm trying to read along and having to find where they're reading. Where if it's just a few lines, obviously it's really easy to pick up. But if it's a whole block of text that's filling up the entire screen, it's a lot harder to pick up, especially if someone, obviously at times we misspeak or say a word wrong or whatever, and it just makes it way harder to actually pick up where you're reading. And it's just another thing that it's not, all these in and of them, like by themselves, aren't the biggest deals, but when we put them together, it just adds more and more distraction than is needed during your message.
So again, just like having one sermon point per screen, this will add more screens to your potential service, which you might be like, that's a lot of screens, but the average person's not thinking about it. And it's actually a lot easier for them to focus when you don't have a ton of text on one screen. So limit how much text is on the screen if you're reading a quote or scripture or anything else that people might be following along with. This brings us to number 5. We're going to go back to worship here for a second, and that is to add backgrounds to your lyric slides. So one of the things, again, this is just a technical thing. You don't have to do it. But like having a black background with white text is boring. And regardless of whether you have lights or not, having a background behind your lyrics, it's kind of warm and inviting, and it just helps focus. So like for us, and again, we're a few years in, so we're not like the church plant phase. We're in our own building. We can control the lights. And for each song, our lights are different, and then we match the background of the lyrics with the light. So if it's a red or a blue or something like that. But there are all that to say, there's lots of free places you can go. Even ProPresenter. I don't know if you do. I think Kevin does most of this.
Yeah, I don't do it.
But there's some free runs in ProPresenter, and then there's places online that you can go. We've, as a side note, have found for lyrics, not just having like a still image, but I don't know what you call them.
Like motion backgrounds.
Motion backgrounds. And there's places you can get them for free, or you can download them, and they're like on 30-second repeats. And they're not distracting, in the background, but they're just like small movements or whatever. But adding something behind your lyrics just helps people focus more. It just seems more inviting than just like white text with a black background. And it's not the end of the world, but this is something that I've noticed is that it's a small tweak and a relatively easy tweak that it seems like a lot of churches don't take advantage of. Because I get it, you're not thinking about it, but it's kind of more inviting, in my opinion, to have some color on your screens, not just black and white.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that this is, there is an art, so to speak, to this, because obviously you could go too far one side and that'd be really boring and just have, text on a black background. But you can obviously go way too far the other way and have a really distracting background. And so finding that middle ground, and it's kind of the same as I said before, if you're not sure what that middle ground is, watch churches that you like. Obviously it's not like everyone's trying to just be a bigger church, but most of the time bigger churches have these things more ironed out. So watch probably a church that's a little bit bigger, more established than you, to see what they're doing, or ask people that are experienced in this field, say like, just send me some backgrounds, or just send me video of some, and then I'll find something similar. But if this isn't your wheelhouse and you're really not sure and are kind of worried that you're going to put something up that's like really cheesy or distracting, then just find what other people are doing and do something similar.
And I would also encourage you, though, with that, is that you have to figure this out as you do it. So don't be afraid to put something up if you're not quite sure. See what it says, get feedback. But just the black background, and the white text, it's somewhat simple to do more than that. So we would encourage you to try some different backgrounds, not distracting backgrounds, but maybe to give it some color. I don't know. It's kind of more inviting. Especially again, Christmas season. Find something red or green or something. I don't know.
It doesn't have to be anything crazy, and there's a lot of free places to get them.
So add some backgrounds to your lyric slides, and then number 5. Are we number 5? 6. This is number 6.
6. Yep.
Kind of with that, if we go back to sermons, not having backgrounds for your sermon slides.
Interesting.
So this is kind of opposite.
The back and forth.
This is just how we do it here. So for our worship slides, we have color, we have their motion, they're moving. But for a sermon, I don't want someone to be staring at the screen. I want them to be staring at me. For worship, people are staring at the screen because they don't know the words.
Yeah.
For a sermon, you don't want them staring at the screen. You want them looking at you. And so one of the ways you could do that is by having a not distracting background. Now, for us, it's not black. It's like a grayish.
Gray. Yeah, like dark gray.
It's like a dark gray, and then we have how we do it is we have the sermon points, which are white, and then we have fill in the blank notes, which we'll share about in a second. And we have certain bolded words that are a certain color that match the sermon series.
Yeah.
So like this
like
series,
highlighted kind of.
we're in Exodus, so it's like a couple of the words are highlighted orange or some color of that. But they're very, very simple for the sermon. So what I would recommend is do something simple. Again, we have like a darker gray. I think it's better than black. I think black and white is just kind of meh. But it could be a darker gray, or it could be something that has to do with your sermon series, just like a solid color with text in front of it, but not having kind of distraction. Just clean and simple for sermons, because for worship, they're looking at the screens. For sermons, you want them looking at the preacher, and screens can be distracting if there's a lot going on.
Yeah, I know a lot of churches do. They'll have like a sort of like a template for a series, like that kind of goes with the color, or maybe has like similar background or whatever to your series art, which we did in the very beginning too. But we just found that when we went to something very simple with big block lettering, that it is painfully obvious when the screens change. Like you can't miss it, and it's just there's I don't know. There's nothing else going on. There's nothing else to look at other than who's preaching or a point that's coming up, and there's nothing else that's distracting. And we'll talk about how we highlight things in a second, but we add a little bit of color in there, and it really helps emphasize what we want emphasized. And it's just one of those things that helps create a distraction-free environment, but it really helps people focus on what the point is, or when the screen's being changed, because it's not like it's. I don't know. It might be easier to figure this out if you actually see it, but it's not like a red background and just some text changes over it. Like when text goes from one thing to the next, it is you can't. There's no mistaking that something's being changed, which I think is helpful.
Yeah, because it's at one point.
Yeah.
So again, not having backgrounds, maybe there's other ways. I'm sure other churches do it differently.
Sure.
But in our context, we've done this for a few years now. We found this works. Again, in our context, we don't have like big LED screens that are showing what's on the preacher plus the point.
Yeah, true.
We just have, which if you're listening to this or watching this, is probably your case as well. Just have a screen or a projector or whatever with the points. And so making it really simple, maybe a darkish background with a light text, and keeping it one point, it just makes it very clean and easy to follow along.
Yeah.
And which leads us to number 7. And that is to print sermon notes out for the screens person and talk through them. So here's what we mean. And this was an issue this past Sunday.
It was.
The guy who was preaching, I wasn't here, so I couldn't have given this feedback. But what I do on Sundays, and anyone else that preaches, we print out our outline, or if you use a manuscript, the manuscript. We give it to the person running screens. We talk it over so that they know exactly when things are being put up and when not to.
Yep.
Because it's kind of a nerve-wracking job, because you don't want to mess up, and if you're not told what to do, you're just trying to wait and listen till the preacher says this point, or if they say it a little bit differently, or you weren't quite paying attention, it could be late or not put up at all. And so what we do is I have an outline that I print out for the screens person, which basically just has the scripture references and the points and the order that they're supposed to be. I very quickly talk through, here's kind of what it's going to be, although it's kind of obvious because we have 1 point per screen, so it's really easy to follow along.
Yeah.
And that way, when it comes to the service, they know what to expect, that it's coming. They know I'm going to share this story, or they see it. It's not just on the computer. They actually can see everything in front of them and read it. And so one of the very easy things you can do, especially if you want your sermon slides to be a little bit more run better than they are right now, is print out your notes, however you use notes, give them to the screens person, and just take a few minutes to talk over that before the service so they know what to expect when you're preaching.
As someone who runs screens, this is so helpful, because obviously we're 3+ years old, and I've heard Dylan preach a million times, and so I'm to the point now where I can follow along pretty well whether there's notes in front of me or not. But someone who's newer isn't maybe hasn't been here from the beginning. Obviously, isn't on staff and isn't paying attention as much. And so having that there, because different, especially if you have maybe if you have a staff or if you bring in other people to preach now and again, people just have different styles of doing things, and it's just different following along with different people. And nothing is, I don't know, one of the most distracting things to me outside of worship, but actually in a message, is when points come up late or wrong point comes up, or just when the screens don't match what's being said. Yep. And so if if you're a person that has like longer points and the point comes up as you finished saying it, then I'm immediately thinking like, what happened back there? Is the person not paying attention? And stuff that like I shouldn't be thinking about and I don't want to be thinking about, but just your mind kind of starts going to all these places when the screens aren't matching. When in reality, the screens are supposed to make you not think about it. Like they shouldn't add another thing for you to think about during the message. And so just having something for people to be able to follow along, because as much as we want the screens person to be paying attention the entire time and not miss a single beat, people are people, and they don't. I mean, I don't sometimes. It just happens. And sometimes you get distracted or something else comes up and whatever. And so especially if you're running the screens and you feel like if you got distracted for a minute and are kind of worried about where they are in the message and feel like you missed something, then you're immediately like reading back, did I miss a point? And then questioning if you missed a point. And it just, a lot of stuff can go on. And so if you have the notes right there, even if you get distracted for a minute, you can really easily anchor yourself back into wherever you are in the message. Yep.
So that's number 7. Print the sermon notes out for their screens person and just talk through them. It takes a few minutes. It makes them feel better, and you'll probably see an improvement on your screens kind of being all over the place. It just reminds me that sometimes we get frustrated with how things go when we haven't done everything in our power to help them go smoothly.
Yeah, for sure.
This is an easy thing that I think people miss, is just talking through their screens person and giving them your notes. Which leads to number 8, the last point that we have, the way to improve your screens, is to use big fonts. Now, part of the way you use big fonts is to limit the text on your screen.
Yep.
So whether it's worship lyrics, not having too many up at one time, or your sermon points, only having one at a time. Part of what makes it, I think, easy here at New City to know what's happening is because the fonts are big.
Yep.
And it's very obvious to read them, and when it goes to the next slide, you see them. And so, and it's different too. So just for like example, like a sermon point, sometimes they're 1 line, sometimes they're 2 lines. Occasionally there might be 3 lines because we use big text, but we try to keep them to 1 or 2 lines. What we'll do is if there's room to make it like 2 lines, like let's say it's a 2-line point, let's say it's like 7 or 8 words and it's taking up 2 lines, is I will make the text bigger to still, as big as it'll go to still fit on 2 lines. Or if it's on 1 line, to make it as big as it'll be just to still fit on 1 line, because it just looks better and it's easier to read and it's cleaner. And so using big text, again, you can only do this if you limit how much text is on your screen, but it's a really easy way for people to stay engaged and to follow along.
Yeah, use big text and use plain font. Don't. There's no need to try and match. Like if you're someone who does sermon, series art and stuff like that, to try and match your points to the font that you use in your series. Like ours never changes no matter what. The only thing we change is sometimes the highlighted color. Which, did we talk about the highlighted color?
Yeah, we did.
Great. But it's always just big, plain block font. So there's no, there's nothing fancy. It's not hard to read for anybody. It's just very simple and plain, and it just takes out any.
But to your point, part of what makes the text engaging is we have 1 or 2 words, again, like we said earlier, that's matched with the thing. So it's like it's emphasized, and it's not just white text is kind of boring. Now we have printout notes, so that makes it easy for them to fill in the blank. But even if you don't print out your notes, it's still like gives it some color. And when you have a point, you're probably emphasizing something about that point. So it gives people something to look at. And so using big fonts and then giving it some color for the sermon slides is helpful too. So there you go. That's
use
8
big plain fonts.
Big plain fonts. That's 8 ways to improve your screen display. Again, as a side note, I was just thinking as well. For us, for lyrics, we do all capital letters. So that takes some of the grammar that's like weird for like sermon lyrics. You're not quite sure, whatever. We just do all capitals, and then for the sermon slides, we don't. We do normal uppercase and lowercase, although we don't use periods and exclamation points. The only punctuation we'll use is a question mark, I think, if we do a question.
Sure, if there's a question.
And if there's a comma needed, we'll put a comma, but we don't put periods or anything on the sermon slides as well, because they've just found they kind of look weird. So big fonts is what you need. So those are 8 kind of technical ways to improve your screen display. But some of these things are maybe easy things to not think about, but then once you realize them, they're kind of some easy, quick tips.
Quick tips. Yep.
So thanks for listening. Again, if you listen to this on the podcast, we'd love a rating and review. And you can find us on YouTube, Practical Church Planting, and watch the videos that way. And we'll be with you next time on Practical Church Planting.